Welcome to the Happier Life Project, the official podcast from the award-winning mental health and wellness app, My Possible Self. Hosted by broadcaster and journalist Gabby Sanderson.
Hello, welcome. Today on the Happier Life Project, we're exploring the profound connection between nature, the mind, and healing with Sue Stuart Smith, psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and best-selling author of The Well-Gardened Mind. Sue's work beautifully illuminates how tending to plants and flowers and produce can also mean tending to ourselves. As she so powerfully puts it, when we work with nature outside us, we work with nature inside us. In this conversation, we talk about gardening as a tool for mental well-being, the deep sensory comfort and sense of safety we can find in nature, and why reconnecting with green spaces is so vital, especially for those of us living in cities. Sue and I also explore the symbolism of flowers. What happens when we become disconnected from the natural world, and how even small moments of contact with nature can help soothe, regulate, and restore us. This is a gentle, grounding conversation and a reminder about remembering what it means to be human and rooted. And if you don't consider yourself to have a green thumb, don't worry, me neither. This conversation isn't about being a good gardener. It's about the profound mental and emotional benefits of simply accessing nature and taking care of our environment. Benefits that are increasingly backed by science. Sue gently dismantles the myth that gardening is only for certain people, reminding us that everyone can learn to grow and tend to plants, produce and flowers, and that the act of trying, noticing and nurturing is where the real healing begins. So, ready to find a healthier, happier you? Let's get started. Sue Stuart Smith, welcome to the Happier Life Project. Absolutely thrilled to have you on the podcast. You were originally trained as a psychiatrist and later as a psychotherapist. So what sparked your interest in exploring the link between gardening, nature and mental health?
Well, I mean, it's a very good question because actually I have to say none of that came up in any aspect of my training at all.
Right.
And I think it is something that continues to be unrecognised, and in spite of a lot of very, very robust research into the benefits of connecting with nature and also engaging in gardening itself. So I suppose for me, I mean, in my mid-20s, I married my husband Tom Stuart Smith. He's a landscape designer. And we started making a garden around our home. And in a way, the two things sort of ran in parallel for me. And I didn't connect them until quite late on. So I was gardening at home. I always loved cooking. I loved growing veg. Tom was making a garden that grew and grew and grew, because as his reputation grew, the garden got bigger. And it wasn't really until I was a consultant in my 40s, and my job was pretty stressful at times anyway, that I began to notice, if I hadn't been in the garden at the weekend, that it was as if on Monday I was going back into work still carrying the load of the previous week. So I began to notice that on a personal level, but I still didn't think about writing it really. I think then I also began to reconnect with my grandfather's story. My mother was still alive, and I wanted to find out more about that from her. So he was a prisoner of war in the First World War in Turkey, and I'd grown up sort of hearing from her that it was when he got the chance to do a course of horticultural rehabilitation in the early 1920s that he got his life back. And he had a lifelong love of gardening. And as children, I mean, he died when I was 12. We loved his garden. It was a bit of a small holding, really. He grew everything. So suddenly these things just began to come together. And I gave a little talk about it, and people came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, you should do a book." And I began to think, "Oh, yeah, maybe I will write a book."
Yeah.
And then I spent 5 years researching and writing it, and I was still a consultant in the NHS at that stage. I worked 3 days a week, so I had time to write.
Okay.
And what's been amazing is that the book really took off, and coming out at the beginning of the pandemic was a moment when people were reconnecting with their gardens and with the natural world, and genuinely feeling how much relief from stress and anxiety you can get through that. You know, it's not going to solve fundamental problems, but it can really make a big difference to how you feel, and also how your mind is functioning, you know, the clarity of your mind.
Yeah. Well, The Guardian called your book a life-affirming study of the pleasures of tending a plot or garden and soothing your mind. So can you recall a moment where that shift happened for you personally? Was it when you were saying about how if you'd not been in the garden during the weekend and then went straight back into work? Because I feel like this passion has been with you for quite some time now.
Yes, but it did feel that there was a moment, and I was asked to give that talk by Christopher Woodward, who's the director of the Garden Museum in London. So when he asked me to do that talk, it was like I had permission to bring these two sides of my life together, if that makes sense. So that was the moment when I realised how much I wanted to say about it and how much it did mean to me. So I think that was really probably the turning point when I thought, I'm going to do something more with this. And I started looking into the research and also what had previously been written, and I felt there were certainly what had previously been written, I felt there were big gaps, because one of the things I feel really strongly about gardening, apart from the anti-stress effects, is that people can feel deeply helped, you know, and recover a sense of existential meaning through working with nature, through working with the cycle of life. And I felt that was sometimes missing, that sort of depth of meaning that people can find in the garden. And so I also set out to do interviews with people, and some of their case studies appear in the book.
Yes, well, you've just done the perfect segue, Sue, because that was going to be my next question. In the book, you share some transformational stories about people quite vulnerable people, but from all walks of life, from people in prison, hospitals, community projects, this feeling of being amongst nature and getting your hands in the earth. Is there one or two, just for our listeners' benefit, stories that kind of stand out to you, or that are maybe favourites, if you will, that demonstrates how healing, I suppose, this can be for someone?
I think one of the visits I did very early on in the book was to a prison in America, in New York. It's Rikers Island Jail, and it's a very large prison. And the Horticultural Society of New York run 3 different gardening projects within it, and it's been going for about 20 years, and it's expanded. It's renowned for being a dark and difficult place. So these gardening projects are sort of, if you like, one small beacon of light within it. And I was very fortunate that I was allowed to sit down with some of the prisoners and interview them in depth, with the lovely horticultural therapist, Hilda Kruss, who runs that project. And I was really struck by some of the inmates had been through repeated cycles of offending, because, you know, the reoffending rates in prisons are, and it's the same here really, it's something like 60% of people are back inside prison within 3 years. So these were people who really wanted to change their lives in some way. They'd often had appalling starts in life, you know, with a neglect or abuse or whatever. And, you know, they hadn't done well in the education system either. They just felt they were no good, really. And gardening, I mean, this may sound a bit sort of simplistic, but gardening actually gave them a way to feel they were doing something good and worthwhile and something they could feel proud of. And I was there when we were harvesting squash plants, so it was autumn. And if you look at a pumpkin seed, it's really quite small, and then only a few months later, really, you can harvest this giant pumpkin and you can share it, you can cook it, and people may even say, wow, you grew that. So I began to get a feel of, actually, particularly for people who have fallen by the wayside in various ways, and this really, applies for kids as well. We're doing a lot of work here in our project at home, the Surge Hill project, with school children. It's such an accessible way to feel you can shape a bit of your world, you can have an impact, and you can feel proud of what you've done. So that made a very big impression on me, actually. I think creating beauty, the effect of creating beauty, feeling you've had a hand in that, is also not to be underestimated.
Yeah, good point.
For me, growing vegetables and bringing them into the house and feeding my children homegrown veg was enormously rewarding, and you do feel you're doing something that's nourishing everybody.
My mum always says the garden is her happy place. She's selling a house, and the most thing that she's gutted about leaving is the garden, because it's quite big, and she just loves going out. I mean, I said to her, just don't bother with buying another house, just go and live in a garden somewhere, because that's where you spend most of your time. Just get a tent. She absolutely loves it, and I've got to admit, like, I'm just kind of starting to come around to it myself. I just kind of always thought, well, the bug thing, I've always been a bit like, oh, I don't want to touch a spider or something, but I've just started myself, like, realizing, just even having plants in the apartment and starting to grow some herbs, actually, I completely see where you're coming from now.
Yeah, I think the garden can give people a very accessible way to be creative as well. Things don't always work out, so you have to sort of take the rough with the smooth in the garden, and you're not the only actor in the garden. There's lots of other insects and animals and all sorts of things living in the garden. So, but in a way, that's also part of it, that you're not completely in control.
Good point. When it comes to our mental health, there's a really lovely metaphor running through the book, and that's as we tend, sort through and weed a garden, and I'm obviously quoting you, we're also tending to our thoughts and mind.
Yeah.
So could you expand on this idea then of gardening the mind?
I think it's both a metaphor in the book and also a real experience. In a way, it goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning. If I was going back into work, having not gardened at the weekend on a Monday, it's just like I hadn't sorted stuff out in my mind. I used to feel when I was weeding, I think weeding can be a kind of meditation almost. It's a kind of mindful activity. You need to focus just enough, but because it's not totally demanding, your mind can still sort of tick over, and you can sift through things, you can sort of sort stuff out a bit. And somehow we seem to do that better in parallel to doing something with our hands. I think cooking can do that for some people too, or handicrafts. It's not unique to gardening. But I think there is a kind of undoubtedly a mindful aspect to gardening, to the process of gardening, which is very important and is a real source of relaxation for people.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that I think is so helpful about the garden, and is absolutely intrinsic, is that it's forward-looking. It's kind of future-orientated. I had a time, which I write about in the book, when I left the NHS. I'd left because of some health problems, which I write about in the book. And I just found it very, very hard to get going again. And the garden really helped me. I was recovering from shingles and various other things. And the garden eventually really helped me, kind of pulled me back in. When you sow seeds, part of your mind is already beginning to look forward to the sort of, them germinating and all the flowers that are going to come from them or whatever it is. And we lose that sense of positive anticipation when we are unwell. If we've been through a big trauma, if we've been through a major bereavement, if we've got, for whatever reason, an issue with anxiety, the future can just feel very, very problematic.
Yeah.
It can feel full of fear. It can feel either we don't dare think about it or we just see something negative in the future. And gardening is a really, really effective way to begin in a very simple way, just to have something to look forward to. And, we saw that effect en masse in that spring of 2020 when people rushed to buy seeds.
Yeah.
The garden was the one area of life, or one of the few areas of life, because everything else was cancelled or postponed and we were all full of fear and anxiety. It was one area where you could still shape your world a bit and plan things and, have something to look forward to.
And for those that didn't have access to a garden, when we were in a lockdown, people really struggled with that.
It was devastating, I think. I think it really did bring that to the fore about what a deprivation it is not to have a park nearby or outside space in your home. I think it did, and I hope we haven't totally lost that understanding. I'm certainly doing my best to keep bringing it up, to the forefront, because I think within our cities, particularly our inner cities, access to green space is a public health issue, really. People don't realise how much of an impact it has on not just mental health, but physical health.
Yeah, yeah.
Where you have a park close by, people are healthier. There have been big population studies that show if you visit a park for half an hour every week, fewer cases of high blood pressure, fewer cases of depression. People's levels of the stress hormone cortisol are healthier, low levels of diabetes, all sorts of things, really. There's so many things that follow on from this.
Yeah, you do share some statistics in the book, but I was looking for kind of the most recent ones. And what I found was globally, 55% of the world's population lived in urban areas as of 2022, with this figure projected to reach 70% by 2050, according to the United Nations. It's not a coincidence that this, with the rapid rates of urbanizations, so are the rapid rates of mental illness.
Yeah, and I think the other ingredient in all of this is screen culture.
Yes.
And our absolute dependence on screens, really. They're very necessary. I don't think we can blame them for all of this, but undoubtedly, looking at a computer, looking at your phone, you are using a very specific form of attention.
Yeah.
And the level of, I suppose, sensory stimulation is sort of channeled and restricted. And you can sometimes just feel it if you go out. If you've been on the computer all morning and you go out into the garden or walk in nature, it's like the world opens up. Sometimes, actually, I think we can get so funneled that you have to almost remind yourself to connect with, listen to the birds singing and, the rustling of the leaves in the wind, just to feel that sense of expansion. There is a lot of very robust research on the beneficial impacts of being in nature for our levels of attention, and particularly also around integrating the brain more effectively. Studies that have shown, for instance, one study which I like to quote was done at Stanford University in California, and it was a group of students. They were divided into two, randomly selected, and they were all taking the same test. And one half had to walk along a highway for 30 or 40 minutes before the test, and another group walked through an arboretum. And the group who walked through the arboretum performed significantly better. And I mean, this has been shown, people have really drilled down into this. It's been replicated time and time again, that it refreshes our cognition.
Yeah.
So if you're stuck in front of if you're at a desk and you're struggling and you realise you're slowing down, go outside.
Yeah.
But also do that thing of focusing, making sure you really are mindfully kind of connecting with the colours, whatever it is, the clouds in the sky. It doesn't really matter. There's something that opens you up to your surroundings.
Well, I just thought it was a really good point. I hadn't thought about proximity to green spaces, reducing aggression, like not to mention the anxiety factor and mental fatigue, which you were just talking about. So why do you think that people tend to behave better and connect more when they're surrounded by plants and trees and grass?
I think there are many, many different aspects to that. I think green is said to be the least sort of demanding colour on our visual system. If you think back also to our hunter-gatherer heritage, through evolution, green is a signal of, this is a flourishing place, a place where you're likely to survive. We know that the body relaxes more in those kind of surroundings. Your blood pressure comes down a bit, heart rate comes down a bit. So people just are a bit more relaxed. I also think it's also about a feeling of safety. Gardens and parks are places where, parks, obviously, you've got to be a bit more careful, but the feeling of sanctuary in a garden is, I think, enormously helpful. People often describe, coming into a garden and they just feel they can just relax, and I think you can feel a bit held in a way. The enclosure of the garden offers you that. And I think then people, they're just more at ease. So I think they connect better.
Well, another wonderful quote from your book: cities are crowded and our minds are crowded too, but a visit to the park can expand our sense of mental space. Yeah. So park, garden, nature, basically. And I thought that's such a valid point, a really good point, because it can, sometimes life, it just, it can feel like everything's getting on top of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, we can all experience that for sure.
Yeah.
And I think, even if you're gardening, actually, I realised about 5 or 6 years after I sort of really got into the garden, and I was working as a consultant in the NHS, and I was very busy at work, and sometimes I would just go out in the garden and I would be looking for the problems and all the jobs I needed to do. And it was like, actually, I suddenly woke up one day and I thought, this isn't right. I've got to, I've got to do this differently, because actually gardens can cause you stress too, particularly if you approach it like that, another thing to do. And so then I started doing this thing of walking out into the garden in my pyjamas in the morning, barefoot, so that I couldn't, weed or do anything. And just, having that initial experience of just being in the garden and, listening to the sounds in the garden. And I found that, so I talk about this balance we need between doing on the one hand and being on the other. I think it's very important that you keep those two things in some kind of balance.
Yeah, well, we had Professor Charles Spence on the podcast to do an episode on the senses. And he said, while some of our senses are being like hyper stimulated, others are kind of being left behind. So like in terms of our sight and sound, there's a lot. And I feel like being amongst nature is kind of the antidote to that, because things sort of slow down. And then we do start to engage more in the senses in a more kind of relaxing and healing way. Like if we think of the smell of the herbs and the cut grass and the sound of the birds, or like the wind on our skin, or the sun on our skin, or the rain on our skin. It's all very sensory. Yeah. And it's kind of nature's way of calming us, I suppose. And it's very restorative. And I do feel like it is the tonic to this hyperstimulation that we're receiving on the other side, which is via the screens and the news and all of the stuff.
Yeah. I think the other aspect to that is about time, because I think we live in this world where you can't do everything 24/7, but you can do a lot of things 24/7, 24 hours of the day. It's kind of like, and any time of year almost. And I think once you start gardening, or if you're closely connected to nature and you're just enjoying the seasons, you have to slow down. You can't speed things up in the garden. Plants will grow at their own pace. Yeah. And also you have to work with nature's cycle, and I think this cyclical calendar it's very grounding for us. It reminds us of the basic facts of life, for starters. It pulls you in if you're a procrastinator, which I can be sometimes. And some of the people I interviewed from my book highlighted that was one of the things they felt was helpful in the garden, is that there comes a point where you think, oh God, if I don't get my seeds in the ground, I'm going to miss the moment. Whereas you can easily have other things sitting there. You think, oh, I could do that next week. I can do that next week. The garden, it does pull you in. You connect with nature in a way that also reminds us we are biological beings too. We have our own seasons of life as well.
Absolutely. You actually wrote in the book as well about how nature can ease loneliness, and obviously coming from the lens of being tied to a mental health app and exploring all things mental health and well-being on this podcast. Loneliness is such, I don't need to tell you, Sue, I'm sure, but it's such a scary epidemic that is affecting so many people, not just with their mental health. We're learning more that it's actually affecting their physical health as well. So in terms of like accessing nature to ease some of that loneliness, what did you mean by that?
Well, I think there's two aspects, two ways, very different ways actually, that I think nature and gardens can help. I think one is just simply feeling part of, almost like the web of life. If you sit in a garden, if you just sit, the birds will come and visit you, the insects will come. You're not alone, you're alone in terms of maybe human company, but you're surrounded by life. And I think that's one of the reasons, a lot of people were alone in the pandemic, in the lockdowns, by force. But for those who had a garden, there was at least that sense of some connection to other life. So I think that's one aspect of it. The other is a much more social aspect, which is to do with things like community gardening projects can offer. Because we touched on the fact that people seem to connect better in nature. And I was very struck by some research that was carried out in America on urban farms and community gardens. And this research group were looking at all the different kinds of impact that those kind of gardens can have, from food to all sorts of things, really, and people's diets and so on. What were the most significant benefits? And what they came up with in the end was this term, gardening as a social bridge, because they found across the board, looking at all these different kinds of urban gardening projects, they all had lots of benefits. But the one they all had in common was that they connected people. And I love this term, gardening as a social bridge, because I think what's great in the garden is you can work together with people, you're working alongside each other, you can connect through food, you can connect through shared pleasures of beauty. There's so many ways that people can connect across all sorts of divides, really, social divides, cultural divides. And in a way, when you're in the garden, it's about the language of plants, in a way. That's what connects you.
Well, another kind of way of connecting, and I'll just ask one question on this. Flowers play such a powerful role in a human's life. I mean, they represent healing. You send get well soon bouquets, romance and courting, weddings, appreciation and thanks. On Mother's Day, the celebration of Easter, grief at funerals, saying I'm sorry for being an idiot or sorry that you're leaving. The list goes on. So why do you think flowers have this kind of universal emotional pull across so many cultures and occasions, but also can be symbolic of different moods and emotions?
Absolutely. I mean, having flowers in the house has been shown to help boost people's moods. So there's no doubt flowers have a very direct effect on us. At a symbolic level, in terms of all the kind of things you're alluding to, I think they're a symbol of both transience and continuity, and I think that's enormously important. We use them to mark new beginnings, we use them to mark endings. So the flower encapsulates, it has the seeds within it. It encapsulates both the sort of the finiteness and the sort of continuation of life.
It shows we care, doesn't it? It's that kind of ultimate gesture of showing that.
Absolutely care, love,
Yeah.
flower. Well, I think beauty is really significant, and I think a lot of the power of a garden, particularly in spring and summer, is about a sort of concentrated dose of beauty you can experience. And I was very, very interested to research how beauty affects us, because I think it is very significant. I was struck when I was interviewing the CEO of a charity that creates gardens in refugee camps. It's called the Lemon Tree Trust. He said when they did their first sort of field trip and were interviewing people in a refugee camp in Kurdistan about what they wanted to grow, they were really surprised that 70% of what they wanted to grow was flowers for their beauty, even though they desperately needed food. They expected it to be the other way around, 70% food, 30% flowers. So I think it's very easy to underestimate the impact of beauty on us. And the neuroscience of beauty is really interesting. This is not only about flowers, it's about all forms of beauty. But when we have an experience that registers as beauty, it's the deep emotional centers in our brain that are stimulated. And the neuroscientist who conducted these studies, who's called Semir Zeki, says that it's the stimulation, the networks that are activated, very similar to romantic love. So beauty has a very powerful impact on us, and it's triggering our reward centers in the brain, release of endorphins, our natural opioids, but also serotonin, our background feel-good neurotransmitter, and dopamine, which is sort of more energizing and motivating. So these little doses of beauty can help. It's not like taking medication, but, it's a significant effect nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a big takeaway for our listeners is there's two ways that we can really kind of embrace this. We can, if we live in a city, maybe go to parks, see if we can get involved in some community projects, any kind of communal green spaces. Absolutely.
And I think a lot, there's so much more focus on volunteering now. Many parks and gardens have volunteer schemes, and that's a way both of connecting with other people and of spending time in nature.
Yeah, because there's the spending time and appreciating part and enjoying everything that nature gives us, but then there's another element to it if you choose, and that's to get involved in trying gardening yourself and trying growing things yourself. And that side, for anybody that's maybe new to this but is curious, what would be a good starting point, do you think, Sue?
Well, I think it depends what your situation is, how much garden you've got, whether you've got any garden. You can grow things in pots on a balcony, window boxes, herbs on the windowsill. I think just start. If you're really new to it, there's a lot of really fantastic stuff online and on Instagram, that will really take you through the basics. But start with things that are simple and start growing flowers that you love. I love growing annual flowers. I grow them alongside the veg in our vegetable garden, and they germinate quite fast. They're so full of colour, whether it's nasturtiums or sweet peas, sunflowers and marigolds. You can just get so much pleasure from these they're very reliable. Some plants are more tricky, so don't start with things that are a bit fussy. Start with things that are relatively easy to get going. And I think if you like cooking, then start growing some of your own food. That's, I think, one of the most rewarding things you can do.
Absolutely. Well, the last line in the book was a real mic drop. I won't quote it exactly, but it's basically reminding us that we're creatures of the earth. And I thought that would be a great way to wrap up this interview as well, because I think we do forget.
We do forget, absolutely. And life in the 21st century pulls us away from that. And as a species, we evolved in nature, and so many aspects of our physiological functioning, our brain functioning, whatever, are primed through evolution to respond to nature's signals. So it's phenomenal, I think, how much we can benefit from making that very simple connection.
Yeah. So this has been an absolute joy. Thank you so much. Thank you for the book. Thank you for the interview. If you've got just 2 more minutes of your time, we do this signature sign-off called the Happier Life Project's Last 5 in 5. It's the same 5 questions I ask every guest to conclude the episode. They're really quick fire.
Yeah.
So, okay, brilliant. When and where are you at your happiest?
Oh, well, I guess it absolutely has to be in the garden. But I think actually what I really love is the combination of water and green. So gazing at water in a garden for me.
What's your favourite thing to do? I think I might know the answer to this, that nourishes your mental health.
I think it is harvesting and cooking.
Yeah.
Bringing things into the kitchen.
What piece of advice do you now know that you wished somebody would have told you earlier that would have made you a happier person?
Not to let one's anxieties dominate one too much, I think. To try to get that in perspective. I think there's something about that thing, you know, just because I feel very anxious about something doesn't mean it's that actually that bad. If I look back at when I was younger, yeah, I think that sense of anxiety sometimes got the better of me. And I think I've sort of learned as I've got older. It's easier as you get older, isn't it? Just generally, often things you think, oh, okay, I've been through this before, kind of feeling. It's almost like that, you know, that book. I can't remember now. Was it Dorothy Rowe? Feel the fear and do it anyway. You know, just get through it. Don't give in to it.
What is the most important one thing that needs to change to make the world a happier place?
I think more direct human-to-human contact, actually. I think getting people together in communities, sharing things, I think that you build bridges that way. So I think it is about the power of people connection. And I think the more we can do to foster that in our communities, the better.
What is a simple, actionable first step that we can take when it comes to gardening for our mental well-being that will help us on our mission to building a happier life?
Do you mean metaphorical gardening or gardening?
I actually meant gardening for our mental well-being, but maybe it's both.
Maybe it is both. I think really it's just get out there and do it. I think gardening can be very intimidating. People feel it's going to go wrong. You know, people worry they haven't got green fingers. There's a complete myth about green fingers. I think everybody's got green fingers. If you want to grow a pumpkin, it will grow. You know, so I think it is about, be brave, get out there and do it.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you again, Sue. So if people want to check out more about you, the website is suestuartsmith.com.
Yep.
And you're also on Instagram, Sue Stuart Smith.
Yep.
The book, The Well-Gardened Mind, is available to purchase in all the usual book places.
It's also an audiobook read by me.
Ah, fantastic. And if anybody needed any more convincing, here's a quick review from Stephen Fry. The wisest book I've read for many years. Much more than a gardening book, much more than a guide to better mental health. Hugely recommend. So there we go.
Thank you very much, Gabby.
Hello friends, it's Gabby back with you. If you are suffering with your mental health, there is a crisis button on the My Possible Self app, which will signpost you to the correct information for immediate expert advice. Those of you who are listening on one of the podcast platforms, the My Possible Self app is completely free to download. You can access all of the content, so you don't need to worry about it costing you anything. If you found this episode helpful, please do subscribe and leave a review and share it with your friends. And to find and follow us on social media, we are most active on Instagram, and you can find us at My Possible Self. And I've been at Radio Gabby. Until the next one, do take care. Bye for now.